I've been doing research and lecturing on the image of women in advertising since the late 1960s. In 1979, a film version of my lecture was made entitled Killing Us Softly. These images are still killing us softly. And by us, I mean all of us, women, men, and children. I think we know by now that the image of women is primarily negative. However, just about everyone has the illusion of being personally exempt from the influence of advertising. So wherever I go, what I hear more than anything else is, well, I of course don't pay any attention to ads. I just tune them out. They don't have any effect on me. It's my feeling that advertising is one of the most powerful educational forces in our society, that it's one of the major ways in which we learn our attitudes. And our attitudes, of course, shape and to a great extent determine our behavior. We are each of us in this country exposed to over 1,500 ads every single day. The average American will spend a year and a half of his or her life watching television commercials, just the commercials. And advertising is, of course, the foundation of the mass media. Advertising is the economic lifeblood of the mass media. The primary purpose of television programs is to round up an audience to be there for the commercials. The primary purpose of the mass media is to deliver audiences to advertisers, so that the advertisers in turn can sell their products. Now the ads do sell products, but they also sell a great deal more than products. They sell values, they sell images, they sell concepts of love and sexuality, of romance, of success, of popularity, and perhaps most important, of normalcy. To a very great extent, they tell us who we are and who we should be. Advertising reflects a mythological world. A world in which, first of all, almost everyone is white. A world in which men outnumber women by 2 to 1, and almost all the women are young and beautiful. 80% of all the women in television commercials are under 40, which is hardly the real world. In addition, it's a world in which absolutely everyone is heterosexual, and furthermore, for the most part, still living in a nuclear family in which the man goes out to work while the woman stays at home with the children. Today, this accurately describes 12% of American households. So much for the real world. In addition, it's a world in which no one is ever disabled, either physically or mentally, unless you count the housewives who talk to little men in toilet bowls, but that's another story. And finally, it's a world in which people talk only about products. This may be the most bizarre aspect of them all. Now, we're surrounded by this. We know it's not real. We know it's an illusion, and yet it's difficult not to, on some level, compare our own lives to it. That's one aspect, and I think it's important. Another that's equally important is that advertising is an over $100 billion a year industry. The advertisers have enormously sophisticated techniques, and we as consumers are, for the most part, completely ignorant of what these techniques are. Not because we're stupid, but because we've never been encouraged to look at the ads and to take them seriously. The first thing the advertisers do is surround us with the image of ideal female beauty, so that we all learn how important it is for a woman to be beautiful and exactly what it takes. Women learn from a very early age that we must spend enormous amounts of time, energy, and above all, money, striving to achieve this ideal and feeling ashamed and guilty when we fail. And failure is inevitable, because the ideal is based on absolute flawlessness. She never has any lines or wrinkles, because that would indicate she'd had the bad taste and poor judgment to grow older. She certainly has no scars or blemishes. Indeed, she has no pores. It's a look that's based absolutely on cosmetics, airbrushing, camera angle. It cannot be achieved. It's inhuman in its flawlessness, and it's the only standard of beauty that there is for women in the culture. Not only is it the only standard of beauty, it's the ultimate standard of worth, so that women are judged against this standard all the time, whether we choose to be or not. When women of color are used, which is not very often, they too must conform exactly to the stereotype, and the basic message is, as it is very literally here, be as white as possible. The look is artificial, and it can only be achieved artificially, and this is a very important aspect of it for women. More than $1 million is spent every hour in our country on cosmetics, every single hour. Now, there's nothing wrong with people wanting to look attractive, men or women, but there's something terribly wrong with the message to women. Because we are told that in order to be considered attractive, we must transform the way we look. We must disguise ourselves, that we will not do the way we are, that our beauty depends upon basically learning how to buy the right products. As a result, what happens is the woman becomes less and less human. She ends up with a face that's much more like a mask than like that of a real human being. Well, the face is a mask, and the body becomes a thing, an object, introducing a new way to wrap your package. And again, the body is turned into a thing, an object, a package. Now, taken individually, these ads are silly, they're often hilarious, they certainly seem sort of harmless, trivial, so what? But my major point throughout this presentation is that there's a cumulative, mostly unconscious impact to this kind of thing. We learn something from it, not just from one ad, but from being surrounded by them. And I think what we learn from this kind of thing is how to relate to women's bodies. Men learn it, but women learn it too. It's difficult not to, surrounded by images like this. Every part of the body has to be altered. Nothing will do the way it is. There's new improved fannies to consider, for example. The underlying message is you're ugly, you're disgusting, buy something. As a result, what happens is the woman's body becomes hacked apart, dismembered in ads. So in ad after ad for all kinds of products, just one part of the body is focused upon. And this is, of course, the most dehumanizing thing you can do to somebody. Not only is she a thing, but just one part of that body is focused upon. Often it's hard to tell, as in this ad, who the real human being is. And this objectification has very serious consequences. It leads inevitably to what we'll see towards the end of this presentation, which are images of actual physical violence against women. It makes sense in an awful kind of way. Turning a human being into a thing is almost always the first step toward justifying violence against that person. And this happens again and again. Every single part of the body is in need of improvement. We also have to, of course, to learn how to manipulate our moods in addition to our bodies to make sure that we're always pleasing, especially to men. Your guy, another reason for my doll. And the copy says, be the you he likes any day of the month. Or a more recent version, finally, Jack Warner can stop suffering from premenstrual tension. Well, finally you've got it together and it should be okay. You got your face sprayed on, your feet are sexy, you got a smile on your face. It should be okay to at least go outdoors, shouldn't it? Forgot about this. And this leads me to what I consider the most offensive campaign in the history of advertising, the campaigns for the feminine hygiene sprays and other products, one of the worst examples of which is this. Feminine odor is everyone's problem. And this ran in TV Guide, which is the nation's #1 selling magazine. A depressing enough fact in itself, but that's another story. I ask you to imagine this ad about any other group in the society. Substitute some ethnic group, for example. It would be unthinkable. TV Guide wouldn't run it, but it's acceptable about women. But what these products, what these ads teach everybody is real contempt, loathing, disgust for women's bodies. I think it's important to see that this contempt is the flip side of the adoration of the sex object. Women are considered acceptable only if they are young, thin, beautiful, made up, sprayed and scented, carefully groomed and polished, and of course with all unwanted hair removed. Women who deviate from this ideal in any way are viewed with disgust, which is to say, most of us, and eventually, all of us. There's particular contempt these days for women who are fat or who are in any way considered overweight. So I think above all, we're supposed to be very thin. I'd probably never be married now if I hadn't lost 49 pounds, which one woman told me was the best advertisement for fat she'd ever seen. It's estimated today that 1 out of 5 college-age women in America has a serious eating disorder, the most common of which are anorexia and bulimia. 80% of American women think they are overweight, and a recent national survey of 4th grade girls found that 80% of them were on diets, 4th graders. Sometimes the advertising is incredibly callous. For example, they've come out with a diet product now called Anorex. And it says it contains a rare and powerful anorectic agent. And in fact, many young women in America are literally starving themselves to death because the ideal body type today for women is virtually unattainable by most women without borderline starvation. This is an ad from the 30s, but still a very contemporary message. You against the rest of womankind, your beauty, your charm, your skin, pitting women against each other in this crazy beauty contest in which we all, of course, inevitably lose. Because if you're a woman and you're against the rest of womankind, you're against yourself. But I think the most tragic aspect of what I'm talking about tonight is the extent to which many women do internalize these messages, do believe them to be true, and do, in fact, end up against themselves and against each other. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. My husband is seeing a younger woman these days, me. But of course, the ad wouldn't work if there weren't this fear that if she didn't use this product, he would, in fact, replace her with a younger woman. And the copy says, just what I want now that I'm over 25. So 25 is a cutoff point after which it's all downhill. It's a little hard to take. For the most part, older women disappear from the world of commercials. So do older men, for that matter, eventually. They wander back occasionally looking for laxatives, but for the most part, they're gone. Now, given this emphasis on youth, it's not surprising that women are still urged to look like, and to be like little girls. Because innocence is sexier than you think. And this is a trend that's been developing over the past 10 years. This is one of the early examples of it. It's been proliferating tremendously in the past several years. Child pornography, images of children in the media, and adult women being presented as children. There's a lot going on in this ad. They spend thousands and thousands of dollars. They know you don't spend a lot of time looking at ads. It doesn't matter. It just takes a few seconds as you flip through magazines, drive past billboards, watch television, for images to register and to affect you cumulatively and, for the most part, unconsciously. And every detail is planned. The shape of the product, for example, the way she's sitting, that she's lifting her skirt, that she's dressed like a little girl but she's got a cleavage. All of this is designed to send out a very powerful sexual message at the same time that it denies it, which is exactly what the ad is telling women to do. The real message is don't grow up, don't become a mature sexual being, stay like a little girl, and what that really means is to stay passive, powerless, and dependent. And of course that's a message that's frustrating and limiting to adult women. It's also a message that's dangerous to little girls. Because the flip side of this is that the little girl herself becomes the ideal, the sex object. You're a Holston woman from the very beginning. Again, they spent thousands and thousands of dollars on this. Clearly the shape of the product, the way she's holding it, is designed to give the illusion of breasts and a cleavage. She's made up, she's being presented as a sex object, and she's probably 5 years old. And this particular ad was from the Sunday New York Times Magazine. So these images are everywhere, and they're increasing. Here's a recent one from Harper's Bazaar. At least 25% of all reported rape victims are under 18, and 1 in 4 little girls in America and at least 1 in 10 little boys is sexually molested during their childhood. It's a problem of staggering proportion. We're just beginning to understand the dimensions of it. Now, images like this don't cause this problem, but I think they do contribute to it. They contribute to it by creating a climate in which it becomes increasingly acceptable to look upon children in this way. They create a climate in which it becomes possible for someone to say, as the Wisconsin judge did recently of the 5-year-old rape victim, that she was unusually promiscuous. Now, attitudes like that should be unthinkable, but attitudes like that flourish in a culture which offers us images of children as sex objects. One of the primary messages of advertising is that products can fulfill us, can meet our deepest human needs. Thus, these needs are often co-opted and trivialized by advertisers. This has certainly happened in recent years with women's need for freedom and power and independence. The whole concept of freedom has been thoroughly co-opted. For example, to me, freedom comes in a bright red package. Now, this co-optation is harmful in all of its forms, but it's lethal, however, when the product is an addictive drug. And I think the most egregious example of this is the very long-running campaign, You've Come a Long Way, Baby, which is still with us. This is quite an amazing ad if you think about it. What they've managed to do in this campaign is to equate liberation with addiction, to equate freedom with enslavement to tobacco. 9 out of 10 smokers say they wish they could quit and feel they can't. That sounds to me more like a definition of slavery than of freedom, but here it's been thoroughly co-opted by Virginia Slims. The only group in the society in which cigarette smoking is increasing is young girls, and in fact the greatest increase is among girls under the age of 11. And I think the reason for this is that they are so heavily targeted and offered cigarettes as a route to independence, as an emblem of independence, and also as a way to control their weight. Virginia Slims. The models are very thin. It's no coincidence. So this too is part of the crazy national obsession with excessive thinness for women. Women's need for financial independence is often joked about and trivialized. How to support yourself in style, and the way to do it is with your bra. Being able to support ourselves is the key to our freedom, and it's no joking matter, but it's often belittled and trivialized in the ads, as in this amazing recent ad. Phoebe chose to work not because she had to, but because it gave her a place to wear her Braemar sweaters. Now, the truth is that most women today are in the paid workforce, and women work for the same reasons men do, primarily sheer economic necessity. At least 1/3 of all the women in the labor force are the sole support of their families, and it's a rare family these days that can get by with one paycheck. But that fact has either been ignored by the advertisers, belittled, or sometimes these days they've come up with some new stereotypes, such as superwoman, the 24-hour woman. But again and again, this is the message that we're getting, that in addition to the 40-hour work week, women are still solely responsible for all the child care, all the domestic responsibilities. Men are very rarely shown with children in ads, and when they are, this is typical of the image, and it's sadly typical of the reality. And when men are separated from children in this way, it harms all of us. The image of men is distorted in advertising too, although in a very different way from the image of women. The primary message to men, in general and in the advertising, is that men should always strive to be invulnerable, to be in positions of power, dominance, and control. Now, this in itself can be a very limiting, very difficult model to continually be surrounded by. But on the deepest level, I feel strongly that the negative and distorted image of women deeply affects not only how men feel about women, but how men feel about everything that gets labeled feminine in themselves. And this to me is a very important point. There's certainly contempt for women in our society. There's no question about that. Years of research document this. There's also contempt for all things considered feminine. And human qualities, qualities that we all share, that we all need, and that we all have the potential to develop, get divided up, polarized, and labeled masculine and feminine. And then the feminine is consistently devalued, which causes women to devalue ourselves and each other, and it causes men to devalue not only women, but also all those qualities that get labeled feminine by the culture. Compassion, cooperation, nurturance, empathy, intuition, sensitivity, vulnerability. We may give lip service to these qualities, but in fact they have very low priority in the society, and men are still very rigidly socialized to repress these qualities in themselves. We, all of us, women and men, have two very basic human needs: to love and to work. We need relationships that are meaningful and work that's meaningful. And the way it's been set up, men have been encouraged to focus entirely on work and women entirely on love, and that division has caused a lot of harm. Most women today are in the paid workforce, but women still earn about 60 cents for every dollar that men do. Something you should all know is that a female college graduate today has the same earning potential as a male high school dropout. Those figures are not getting any better. Most working women are in dead-end jobs making less than $10,000 a year, and 1 out of 4 women working today can expect to be poor in her old age. It doesn't matter how you dress. What would matter would be recognizing this as a political issue, and one that can be changed if we work together to end the discrimination, that the struggle for equality for women is far from over. And one of the things that has alarmed me, and I know many others too, is the extent to which a lot of young women seem to buy the myth that if you get your own act together, you too can step into a glamorous, high-paying career, raise your children without seeking any kinds of broader changes in the society. Far from being strictly personal, this issue is global and economic. Women provide a huge pool of cheap labor all around the world. Multinational corporations depend upon this cheap labor and therefore generally fight any movement for equal pay or equal rights for women. In their advertising, these corporations sometimes give lip service to equality for women, but the underlying message is often just the opposite. It's true that more women than ever before are shown in ads today in the paid workforce. But if you look below the surface, you often find that the emphasis is still on her sexuality. She's still a sex object. This may be an important business meeting, but they're all looking down her blouse. And this is really typical of the kind of the working woman, the professional woman who's still trivialized and sexualized. This woman is allegedly a real doctor, a physician. And she's flashing her underwear at us. I ask you to imagine an ad in which a male doctor was revealing his underwear. It would be unthinkable. Or here the woman in the low-cut blouse offering someone who's clearly a colleague or an employer a drink. And this idea that no matter where women are, they're still sexually available, sexually ready, sexually willing, certainly contributes to a climate in which there's widespread sexual harassment of women in the workplace. So what's the problem? So we're surrounded by all of this. I think one of the problems is that we're surrounded by ads, by films, by music that promote a very casual attitude towards sex and that particularly target young people. There's a tremendous emphasis on being swept away, on passion, on all this kind of thing, and never, again, any kind of honest information or emphasis on responsibility. So no wonder the U.S. has a greater problem with teenage pregnancy than any other industrialized nation in the world. The problem isn't sex, it's that there isn't enough honest, accurate information about it or enough of an emphasis on relationships and intimacy. The real problem is the culture's pornographic attitude towards sex, an attitude that's both created by and reflected in the advertising and indeed throughout the media. Sex, of course, is not obscene. The real obscenity is the reduction of sexuality to a dirty joke and of people to objects and of the marketing of women as products. Now, sex in advertising is pornographic in lots of ways that we've seen, the dehumanization and objectification of the body, the dismemberment, all of that. It's also pornographic because it's always commercial, it's always used to sell, and it is used to sell everything. Whatever you're giving him tonight, he'll enjoy it more with rice. I don't think I'm particularly naive, but I haven't figured out yet what the hell you do with rice. And often in ways that are very graphic. Now again, we learn something from this, not just from one ad, but we learn something cumulatively and unconsciously, and I think what we learn is that a woman's body is just another piece of merchandise. Not only is she a thing, she's a thing that's for sale. And women's bodies and products are completely interchangeable in the world of ads. Now, men are used as sex objects too, sometimes in ads, not as often as women, but they are, and increasingly in ads like this. Size has nothing to do with performance. For this kind of image or the use of double entendre, as in this classic, which is one of my all-time favorites, I don't judge my cigarette by its length. Seems to be a little anxiety going on there, too, I'd say. But I don't think men being used as sex objects is such a major problem. It doesn't have the whole weight of the culture behind it. For one thing, it doesn't happen to nearly the extent that it does with women. I think a far more serious problem for men is the way in which masculinity is so often linked with ruthlessness and brutality in ad after ad after ad. Put your gun into something soft. And this certainly quite clearly links sexuality with violence. It links male sexuality with something weapon-like, brutal, and female sexuality with something weak and passive and vulnerable. And of course, when sexuality is defined in those ways, it harms all of us. I've noticed for years that women's bodies and products are interchangeable. Lately, that's become particularly sadistic and brutal, as in this ad. Treat them good and they'll treat you good. And the copy says, some men treat their boots better than their women. Not altogether admirable, but certainly understandable. Women are still presented as passive, powerless, vulnerable, always sexually available, waiting for it, wanting it. There's a whole trend in advertising these days, what I call the romantic stranger. Lots of them. In these ads, the woman is outside and there's a shadowy figure lurking in the background, and the idea is always that a romance is about to take place. Here it says, let the adventure begin. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm outside and there's a shadowy figure lurking in the background, romance is the last thing on my mind. So one of the things that this certainly does is it trivializes the whole seriousness of the whole issue of violence against women, something that's epidemic in our society. Battering these days is presented sometimes as a joke. Every woman is the victim of violence, whether she's been the victim of an actual physical assault or not. All of us live in a climate of fear because of all the violence against us, and our lives are severely restricted as a result of that fear. Or this very bizarre one that ran in lots of magazines. She's laughing, this is supposed to be funny, but what's being depicted here is torture, that's an iron, and look where it is. We're told that poison is my potion. One of the dominant myths of the culture is that there is within women an evil, destructive force that needs to be contained and controlled. At the same time, we're told that men are beasts, a cologne for the other man lurking inside you, that men have dangerous animal natures that can't be controlled, certainly insulting to men, and also an attitude that clearly leads inevitably to aggression and to violence. This is certainly a mock rape, if not an actual one. According to the Ms. Campus Project on Sexual Assault, 1/4 of women in college today have been the victims of rape or attempted rape, and 90% knew their assailants. So that what's known as date rape, acquaintance rape, is a major problem. And yet we're told again and again that women want to be overpowered, want to be beaten even. This is an early example of this trend in the music. I'm Black and Blue from the Rolling Stones, and I love it. This campaign perpetuating that devastating myth that women love and deserve to be beaten, a myth that, of course, makes it extremely difficult for the millions of women who are the victims of violence every year to get help. The FBI estimates that violence occurs today in 1 out of every 3 homes in our country in which men and women live together, and it's this attitude more than any other that makes it difficult for the victims to get help and for the whole issue to be taken seriously. These images have been particularly prevalent on record album covers. These are a couple of examples. There are many more current ones, and they're also very prevalent these days on music video, which contains an enormous amount of violence. And these messages are also in the films. Films like this, the slasher movies have as their whole point the brutal murders of young women. The research indicates that, of course, this affects us. It doesn't necessarily make us more violent, but it does make us more callous to violence. The terrible truth is that 40% of all the women who are murdered in this country are killed by their husbands or lovers. The violence is inside our homes and inside our marriages and inside our institutions, and that's a terrible fact for all of us, for men as well as for women. But until we recognize it, we won't be able to solve it. Images like this create a climate, just as the images of little girls do, in which this kind of thing is seen as more acceptable. They don't directly cause violence, but they create a climate in which it's seen as more tolerable. This image ran in Family Circle. Or this ad for shoes from Vogue magazine, featuring a woman lying on what looks like a bathroom floor. That's a man's face in the mirror. This certainly looks like rape or murder to me, and it's casually being used to sell. This was a store window, department store. It says, "We'd kill for these." There's a female corpse in a shroud in a garbage can, blood on her face, and a shoe across her throat. Now, this was stopped as a result of protests, but of course it should be unthinkable. We shouldn't need laws against this kind of thing, and that's not what I'm advocating. I don't support censorship, but it should be out of the question. This was several years ago. This was another store window this year, another corpse in a garbage can, basically. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is not an aberration. This is the inevitable result of everything we've seen tonight from the very beginning. This is the inevitable result of this kind of socialization that socializes all of us all too often to equate masculinity with dominance and brutality, and femininity with submission and passivity, and that violence is always inevitable whenever you turn a human being into a thing.
There are clearly problems with advertising that go beyond sexism and violence. Advertising co-ops and trivializes all movements for social change. Real change lies in social and political action regarding our priorities as a nation, not in protesting individual ads. Such change will take a long time and will depend upon, more than anything else, an aware, active, educated public that demands better. In the meantime, however, these images are wounding us, all of us, women, men, and children, and I feel strongly that some immediate action is essential as we work together for much more profound, longer-range change within the society.
Both the advertisers and the critics acknowledge the fundamental role that advertising plays in this economy. There's no question about that. The critics suggest that advertising is the propaganda of American society, that advertising teaches all of us to be, above all, consumers, that happiness can be bought, that there are instant solutions to life's complex problems. In television commercials, the most complicated problems in the world are magically resolved in 30 seconds just by using the right product. And as a result, we all learn, cumulatively, unconsciously, that products can fulfill us, can meet our deepest human needs. The critics suggest further that advertising is inherently exploitive, that it exists primarily to motivate us to buy things that we don't need and that are often harmful to ourselves or to our environment. And finally, that it depends upon making us feel anxious and insecure, that it simply wouldn't work if it didn't arouse these feelings in us. Most important is to become as aware as possible of these images, of these stereotypes, not just in the ads, but everywhere, because they are everywhere, and of their impact on you, your life, your relationships, and then to get actively involved in the struggle to bring about change, not just in the ads, but in these attitudes in the society, to realize that the struggle for equality for women is far from over, and that it's a struggle that will benefit all of us, women and men, that what's at stake for all of us is our ability to have authentic and freely chosen lives, nothing less. Thank you very much.